The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who chase the spotlight, and then there are those who build it. Benny Andersson has always been the latter. For decades, the world sang along to ABBA's anthems without fully understanding who was truly responsible for the magic embedded inside them. The sequined costumes, the choreography, the larger-than-life performances, those were the images that burned into pop culture forever. But beneath all of that spectacle lived something far more complex, a man of extraordinary musical depth who spent most of his career working in deliberate shadow, pouring his entire emotional world into songs that millions loved without ever knowing his name the way they should have. Now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally talking. Not in the carefully managed, publicist-approved way that celebrities usually speak when they reminisce about glory days. He is talking with the kind of quiet, unhurried honesty that only comes when a person has lived long enough to stop caring about how the story makes them look. What he is confirming, piece by piece, are the things that devoted fans and careful observers always suspected but could never quite prove. The real story of ABBA is not just a story about pop music. It is a story about loneliness inside success, about love expressed through melody rather than words, about a man who gave everything to his art and sometimes left the people around him with almost nothing. To understand Benny Andersson at 78, you have to go back to the boy he once was, growing up in Sweden surrounded not by radio hits or teenage ambition, but by the steady, grounding presence of folk music, classical composition, and church harmonies. From an early age, Benny did not simply hear music the way most children do. He heard architecture. He heard the emotional logic hidden inside a chord progression, the way a suspended note could carry an entire room into a feeling it had not expected to feel. While other kids were outside playing, Benny was absorbing the structural language of sound, developing an inner compass that would later become the invisible engine driving one of the most commercially successful bands in history. His earliest musical training was informal but deeply formative. The Swedish accordion traditions that surrounded his childhood gave him a sense of rhythm and folk melody that never left him. Church music gave him an understanding of harmony and restraint, of how silence between notes is just as powerful as the notes themselves. By the time he reached his teenage years and began playing in Swedish beat groups during the early 1960s, Benny was already operating with a musical sophistication that most of his peers would not develop for years, if ever. He was not performing for applause. He was experimenting with feeling, always chasing the precise emotional response that he believed a well-constructed melody could produce in a listener. When Benny eventually joined forces with Björn Ulvaeus, the partnership that would become the creative backbone of ABBA, something genuinely rare happened. Two complementary minds found each other. Björn's gift was storytelling through lyrics, his ability to construct narratives and emotional situations within the confines of a pop song. Benny's gift was translating those stories into sound, finding the chords and arrangements that would make a listener feel the story even before they processed a single word of it. Their collaboration was not simply songwriting. It was a kind of emotional engineering, and the precision of their combined craft is why ABBA's music has outlasted almost every trend that surrounded it. Here is what most people still do not fully appreciate about ABBA's music: the sadness was intentional. Those gorgeous, shimmering, danceable songs were not accidentally bittersweet. The minor chord buried inside a major progression, the melody that lifts just before it descends, the arrangements that feel celebratory on the surface but carry a quiet ache underneath. All of that was Benny's doing. He has spoken in recent years about how he never set out to write simply happy music. He set out to write honest music, and honesty, in his experience, always contained both light and shadow. This explains something that fans have noticed for years without being able to articulate it clearly. You can play an ABBA song at a wedding and have everyone dancing, and then play that same song in an empty room late at night and feel almost unbearably lonely. That dual nature is not accidental. It is the signature of a composer who understood that the most powerful emotional experiences in life are almost never singular. Joy and grief live close together. Celebration and loss often share the same moment. Benny built that complexity directly into the music, and he did it so skillfully that most listeners absorb it without realizing what they are feeling or why. In the studio, Benny was relentless in a way that those who worked with him still remember clearly. He was not a perfectionist in the cold, technical sense of that word. He was something harder to define, a man in pursuit of emotional truth inside a recording. He would rework a single harmony for an entire day not because the previous version was technically wrong, but because it did not feel exactly right. There is a significant difference between those two standards, and Benny always operated according to the second. The feeling had to match the intention perfectly, or the work was not finished. This standard is exhausting to maintain, but it is also the standard that separates music people enjoy from music people carry inside them for the rest of their lives. What makes Benny's recent honesty so striking is his admission that while he was obsessing over every note in the control room, he was simultaneously retreating from everything happening outside of it. The studio was his world, his controlled environment, the one place where he felt genuinely competent and safe. The rest of life, the personal relationships, the emotional confrontations, the vulnerability required to really be known by another person, those things terrified him in a way that a complex chord arrangement never did. And so he kept choosing music over presence, and the people in his life kept paying a price he did not fully understand he was charging them. Benny's relationship with Annie Frid Lyngstad, known universally as Frida, is one of the great love stories embedded inside ABBA's history. They met through the music, fell together through the music, and in many ways were undone by the music too. What Benny has been willing to say about this relationship in recent years reveals a pattern that runs through his entire emotional life, a pattern he is only now able to name clearly. Frida was emotionally expressive, direct, and deeply feeling. She came from a background marked by real hardship, by abandonment and early grief, and those experiences had taught her the necessity of genuine connection. She needed to be met. She needed the person she loved to show up not just in the studio, but in the ordinary, messy, unscored moments of actual life. Benny, for all his genius, was not built that way. He had learned from childhood to process his emotions internally, to find his expression through music rather than conversation, and that habit had calcified into something almost structural by the time ABBA reached its peak. He has said that he was more emotionally available inside a recording session than he ever was at home. Behind the piano, everything he felt could be expressed perfectly. The notes did the work he did not know how to do with words. But when the session ended and the studio door closed behind him, that fluency disappeared. The man who could make millions of strangers cry through a chord progression could not tell the woman he loved what was happening inside him. He has acknowledged this openly now, with a kind of unsentimental clarity that suggests he has thought about it for a very long time. Songs like The Winner Takes It All and One of Us carry a weight that goes far beyond professional songwriting. These were not exercises in imagined heartbreak. They were transmissions from real pain, real loss, real confusion about love and responsibility and what it means to let someone down. But the painful irony that Benny himself has pointed out is this. He wrote those songs instead of having the conversations that might have changed things. The music gave him a way to express the emotion without the risk of real confrontation. He could put everything into the song, deliver it through Frida's voice, and watch audiences respond with tears, all while remaining personally untouched by the direct weight of what he was confessing. He has called this a form of cowardice, though perhaps that word is too harsh. It was the coping mechanism of a man who had never developed a different language for vulnerability. Music was his native tongue. Everything else felt foreign and dangerous. The tragedy is not that he used music to process his feelings. The tragedy is that the people who needed him to speak directly to them received melodies instead of presence, and melodies, no matter how beautiful, cannot hold a person through the night. One of the most quietly painful things Benny has confirmed in recent years is the experience of feeling invisible inside the very thing he created. ABBA was a visual phenomenon as much as a musical one. Agnetha and Frida were stunning, charismatic, and camera-ready in a way that defined the era. They were ABBA to most of the world, and the media understood that image sells in ways that craft does not. Benny and Bjorn became, in the popular shorthand, the men behind the music, a description that sounds respectful but functions as erasure. Benny has spoken about reading press coverage during the height of ABBA's fame and searching, genuinely searching, for acknowledgement of the musical architecture he had spent years constructing. He would look for some recognition that the chord structures were unusual, that the arrangements were doing something sophisticated, that the production techniques they were pioneering in Stockholm were ahead of what anyone else in pop music was attempting. Occasionally someone noticed. Most of the time, they did not. The music was called catchy, infectious, perfect pop. All of those descriptions, while positive, missed the point entirely. Catchy suggests accident. What Benny was doing was anything but accidental. The label that bothered him most was being called the cold brain of ABBA, the implication that he was a kind of musical technician, smart and capable but fundamentally unemotional. He has said that description felt like a profound misunderstanding of everything he was actually doing. Every song he wrote was an emotional act. The precision was not the opposite of feeling. It was the container for feeling, the careful structure that allowed emotion to exist in a form that could be shared with strangers across the world. Calling him cold because he was precise was like calling a surgeon cold because they do not cry during the operation. The emotion was there. It was simply disciplined. This experience of being misread, of being present at the center of something enormous and still feeling fundamentally unseen, created a quiet resentment that Benny rarely expressed directly. He is not a person who makes declarations of grievance. He turned the frustration inward, channeled it into work, and carried it with him for decades. What he is doing now, in his late 70s, is something more valuable than complaint. He is correcting the record with patience and precision, explaining to anyone willing to listen what was actually happening inside those recording sessions, inside those songs, inside the man the cameras always moved past to find a more photogenic subject. The end of ABBA is often described in cultural shorthand as a romantic implosion. Two couples, two divorces, too much personal wreckage to continue making music together. And while the personal relationships certainly contributed to the atmosphere in which the band dissolved, Benny's account of what actually happened is considerably more nuanced and, in many ways, more heartbreaking than the simple narrative of romantic collapse. He has described the final years of ABBA not as a period of dramatic conflict, but as a slow exhaustion of creative truth. There came a point, he has said, when he no longer believed in what they were making in the same way he once had. The spark that made the early recordings feel urgent and necessary, that sense of discovering something together for the first time, had faded. They were still capable of making technically excellent music. The craftsmanship never left them. But craft without the animating spirit of genuine discovery is just skilled repetition, and Benny knew the difference intimately. He stayed longer than he should have, and he has been honest about why. Not because the music was still feeding him, but because of obligation. Because the band had become something much larger than any individual inside it, an economic entity, a cultural institution, and the weight of responsibility to everyone connected to that entity kept him in his seat long after his heart had quietly left the room. He has described this period as one of the loneliest of his life, and there is something particularly painful about that description. Lonely inside ABBA, at the height of global success, surrounded by people who needed him to keep producing the magic. When ABBA finally came to its unceremonious end, there was no dramatic farewell, no formal announcement, no closure in any meaningful sense. Things simply stopped. People went in different directions. The silence that followed was, for Benny, more complicated than relief. It took him years, he has admitted, to process what the experience had actually cost him, and years beyond that to understand what it had given him. ABBA took nearly everything he had. It also made him, in ways he is still discovering. In the decades since ABBA, Benny has done something that many artists in his position never manage. He has rebuilt a creative life entirely on his own terms. The work he has done in theater, orchestral composition, and film scoring represents a different kind of artistic freedom, one uncoupled from commercial expectation or the complicated social dynamics of a group. He has spoken about finding genuine happiness in this quieter creative life, a happiness that is less thrilling than the ABBA years but considerably more sustainable. He has also done the slower, harder work of emotional reckoning. He has talked about confronting the patterns of his personal life, understanding how his relationship with music became a way of avoiding the kinds of vulnerability that real intimacy requires. He does not speak about this with self-pity or dramatic regret. He speaks about it the way someone speaks when they have genuinely processed something, when understanding has replaced blame and clarity has replaced confusion. The man who once let a piano say everything he was afraid to say directly has learned, gradually, to also use words. What Benny is confirming at 78 is something that was always there if you listened carefully enough to the music. He was never simply a pop craftsman producing entertainment for a global market. He was a deeply interior person who found in music the only language precise enough to carry his actual emotional experience. ABBA's songs were not manufactured product. They were confessions, expressed in the only form Benny trusted. Every minor key buried inside a major one, every melody that rises and then aches back down, every arrangement that makes you feel something you cannot quite name. That was him, speaking as clearly as he knew how.